And I think we're back? Maybe? No, not back yet. Okay, give me a minute. Let me see if this is coming through. I gotta find out where I left off. I'm probably just gonna start at the beginning of the chapter. Uh, yeah, some weird technical issue that popped up. I don't know what happened. OBS froze on me. I don't know why. Really, really unclear on why it did that. But we are back now. It looks like, yes, it is doing it on there. And it is also doing it on there. Good. Okay. We're backish. We're back. Again, don't know what happened. Sorry about the interruption. It'll just have to be in two parts. Sorry. So we're gonna. I don't know if we left off before the end of chapter 6, but that's where we're gonna take it from the top of, I think. Yeah. Let me real quick actually check to see where we left off. Maybe it would have cleared itself up. I'm glad I noticed it. I was good that I saw that it happened. It's better than I usually do. Come on. Where did we leave off here? Oh, okay. So I guess we were in like one page into chapter 6. So should have. Okay. So we were like one page into chapter 6. Um, that's actually at a semi-convenient. I'll still take the chapter from the top so that there's no interruption. So I'm sorry. Sorry for the dead space a second ago. Sorry for the break in service. So chapter 6 from the top again. It's only really one page. Well, 2 pages I'll have to cover, but it's fine. God, I always sound like I'm really stuffed in the head, and I'm not, I swear. It's the microphone. It's got to be the microphone. I should probably get like a good microphone at some point, as opposed to a headset. The headset is comfy. It lets me kick my feet up, lean back, and read in comfort, as opposed to, you know. Also, I don't have a really great environment for a good mic anyway, but I could figure it out. Anyway, chapter 6. We're back. Daniel pushed his way through the small crowd of protesters gathered at the entrance to his San Francisco tower. He could have come and gone by helicopter instead, but his security consultants had assessed these people as posing no significant threat. A small amount of bad PR didn't bother him. He was no longer selling anything that the public could boycott directly, and none of the businesses he dealt with seemed worried about being tainted by association. He'd broken no laws and confirmed no rumors. A few feral cyberphiles waving placards reading, "Software is not your slave," meant nothing. Still, if he ever found out which of his employers had leaked details of the project, he'd break their legs. Daniel was in the elevator when Lucian messaged him. Moon very soon. He halted the elevator's ascent and redirected it to the basement. All 3 crystals were housed in the basement now, just centimeters away from the playpen. A vacuum chamber containing an atomic force microscope with 50,000 independently movable tips, arrays of solid-state lasers and photodetectors, and thousands of microwells stocked with samples of all the stable chemical elements. The time lag between Sapphire and this machine had to be as short as possible, in order for the fights to be able to conduct experiments in real-world physics while their own world was running at full speed. Daniel pulled up a stool and sat beside the playpen. If he wasn't going to slow Sapphire down, it was pointless aspiring to watch developments as they unfolded. He'd probably view a replay of the lunar landing when he went up to his office, but by the time he screened it, it would be ancient history. One giant leap would be an understatement. Wherever the fights landed on the moon, they would find a strange black monolith waiting for them. Inside would be the means to operate the playpen. It would not take them long to learn the controls, or to understand what this signified. If they were really slow in grasping what they'd found, Daniel had instructed Primo to explain it to them. The physics of the real world was far more complex than the kind the fights were used to, but then no human had ever been on intimate terms with quantum field theory either, and the thought police had already encouraged the fights to develop most of the mathematics they'd need to get started. In any case, it didn't matter if the fights took longer than humans to discover 20th century scientific principles and move beyond them. Seen from the outside, it would happen within hours, days, weeks at most. A row of indicator lights blinked on. The playpen was active. Daniel's throat went dry. The fights were finally reaching out of their own world into his. A panel above the machine displayed histograms classifying the experiments the fights had performed so far. By the time Daniel was paying attention, they had already discovered the kinds of bonds that could be formed between various atoms, and constructed thousands of different small molecules. As he watched, they carried out spectroscopic analyses, built simple nanomachines, and manufactured devices that were, unmistakably, memory elements and logic gates. The fights wanted children, and they understood now that this was the only way. They would soon be building a world in which they were not just more numerous, but faster and smarter than they were inside the crystal. And that would only be the first of 1,000 iterations. They were working their way toward godhood, and they would lift up their own creator as they ascended. Daniel left the basement and headed for his office. When he arrived, he called Lucian.
"They've built an atomic-scale computer," Lucian announced, "and they've fed some fairly complex software into it. It doesn't seem to be an upload, though. Certainly not a direct copy on the level of beads."
He sounded flustered. Daniel had forbidden him to risk screwing up the experiments by slowing down Sapphire, so even with Primo's briefings to help him, it was difficult for him to keep abreast of everything. "Can you model their computer and then model what the software is doing?" Daniel suggested.
Lucian said, "We only have 6 atomic physicists on the team. The fights already outnumber us on that score by about 1,000 to 1. By the time we have any hope of making sense of this, they'll be doing something different."
"What does Primo say?" The Thought Police hadn't been able to get Primo included in any of the lunar expeditions, but Lucian had given him the power to make himself invisible and teleport to any part of Sapphire or the lunar base. Wherever the action was, he was free to eavesdrop.
"Primo has trouble understanding a lot of what he hears. Even the boosted aren't universal polymaths and instant experts in every kind of jargon. The gist of it is that the Lunar Project people have made a very fast computer in the outer world, and it's going to help with the fertility problem somehow."
Lucian laughed.
"Hey, maybe the fights will do exactly what we did. See if they can evolve something smart enough to give them a hand. How cool would that be?"
Daniel was not amused. Somebody had to do some real work eventually. If the fights had just passed the buck, the whole enterprise would collapse like a pyramid scheme. Daniel had some business meetings he couldn't put off. By the time he'd swept all the bullshit aside, it was early afternoon. The fights had now built some kind of tiny solid-state accelerator, and were probing the internal structure of protons and neutrons by pounding them with high-speed electrons.
An atomic computer wired up to various detectors was doing the data analysis, processing the results faster than any in-world computer could. The fights had already figured out the standard quark model. Maybe they were going to skip uploading into nanocomputers and head straight for some kind of femto machine? Digests of Primo's briefings made no mention of using the strong force for computing, though. They were still just satisfying their curiosity about the fundamental laws. Daniel reminded himself of their history. They had burrowed down to what seemed like the foundations of physics before, only to discover that those simple rules were nothing to do with the ultimate reality. It made sense that they would try to dig as deeply as they could into the mysteries of the outer world before daring to found a colony, let alone emigrate en masse. By sunset, the fights were probing the surroundings of the playpen with various kinds of radiation. The levels were extremely low, certainly too low to risk damaging the crystals, so Daniel saw no need to intervene. The playpen itself did not have a massive power supply, it contained no radioisotopes, and the thought police would ring alarm bells and bring in human experts if some kind of tabletop fusion experiment got underway, so Daniel was reasonably confident that the fights couldn't do anything stupid and blow the whole thing up. Primo's briefings made it clear that they thought they were engaged in a kind of astronomy. Daniel wondered if he should give them access to instruments for doing serious observations, the kind that would allow them to understand relativistic gravity and cosmology. Even if he bought time on a large telescope, though, just pointing it would take an eternity for the fights. He wasn't going to slow Sapphire down and then grow old while they explored the sky. Next thing they'd be launching space probes on 30-year missions. Maybe it was time to ramp up the level of collaboration and just hand them some astronomy texts and star maps? Human culture had its own hard-won achievements that the fights couldn't easily match. As the evening wore on, the fights shifted their focus back to the subatomic world. A new kind of accelerator began smashing single gold ions together at extraordinary energies, though the total power being expended was still minuscule. Primo soon announced that they'd mapped all three generations of quarks and leptons. The fight's knowledge of particle physics was drawing level with humanity's. Daniel couldn't follow the technical details anymore, but the experts were giving it all the thumbs up. Daniel felt a surge of pride. Of course his children knew what they were doing, and if they'd reached the point where they could momentarily bamboozle him, soon he'd ask them to catch their breath and bring him up to speed. Before he permitted them to emigrate, he'd slow the crystals down and introduce himself to everyone. In fact, that might be the perfect time to set them their next task, to understand human biology well enough to upload him, to make him immortal, to repay their debt. He sat watching images of the fight's latest computers, reconstructions based on data flowing to and from the AFM tips. Vast lattices of shimmering atoms stretched off into the distance, the electron clouds that joined them quivering like beads of mercury in some surreal liquid abacus. As he watched, an inset window told him that the ion accelerators had been redesigned and fired up again. Daniel grew restless. He walked to the elevator. There was nothing he could see in the basement that he couldn't see from his office, but he wanted to stand beside the playpen, put his hand on the casing, press his nose against the glass. The era of Sapphire as a virtual world with no consequences in his own was coming to an end. He wanted to stand beside the thing itself and be reminded that it was as solid as he was. The elevator descended, passing the 10th floor, the 9th, the 8th. Without warning, Lucian's voice burst from Daniel's watch, priority audio crashing through every barrier of privacy and protocol. "Boss, there's radiation. Net power gain. Get to the helicopter. Now!" Daniel hesitated, contemplating an argument. If this was fusion, why hadn't it been detected and curtailed? He jabbed the stop button and felt the brakes engage. Then the world dissolved into brightness and pain.
Chapter 7. When Daniel emerged from the opiate haze, a doctor informed him that he had burns to 60% of his body, more from the heat than from radiation. He was not going to die. There was a net terminal by the bed. Daniel called Lucian and learned what the physicists on the team had tentatively concluded, having studied the last of the playpen data that had made it off-site. It seems that the Fights had discovered the Higgs field and engineered a burst of something akin to cosmic inflation. What they'd done wasn't as simple as merely inflating a tiny patch of vacuum into a new universe, though. Not only had they managed to create a cool Big Bang, they had pulled a large chunk of ordinary matter into the pocket universe they'd made, after which the wormhole leading to it had shrunk to subatomic size and fallen through the Earth. They had taken the crystals with them, of course. If they'd tried to upload themselves into the pocket universe through the lunar data link, the thought police would have stopped them. So they'd emigrated by another route entirely. They had snatched their whole substrate and ran. Opinions were divided over exactly what else the new universe would contain. The crystals and the playpen floating in a void with no power source would leave the Fights effectively dead, but some of the team believed there could be a thin plasma of protons and electrons too, created by a form of Higgs decay that bypassed the unendurable quark-gluon fireball of a hot Big Bang. If they'd built the right nanomachines, there was a chance that they could convert the playpen into a structure that would keep the crystals safe, while the Fights slept through the long wait for the first starlight. The tiny skin samples the doctors had taken finally grew into sheets large enough to graft. Daniel bounced between dark waves of pain and medicated euphoria, but one idea stayed with him throughout the turbulent journey, like a guiding star. Primo had betrayed him. He had given the fucker life, entrusted him with power, granted him privileged knowledge, showered him with the favors of the gods. And how had he been repaid? He was back to zero. He'd spoken to his lawyers. Having heard rumors of an illegal radiation source, the insurance company was not going to pay out on the crystals without a fight. Lucian came to the hospital, in person. Daniel was moved. They hadn't met face to face since the job interview. He shook the man's hand. "You didn't betray me." Lucian looked embarrassed. "I'm resigning, boss." Daniel was stung, but he forced himself to accept the news stoically. "I understand. You have no choice. Gupta will have a crystal of his own by now. You have to be on the winning side in the War of the Gods." Lucian put his resignation letter on the bedside table.
What war? Are you still clinging to the fantasy where uber dorks battle to turn the moon into computronium?
Daniel blinked. "Fantasy? If you didn't believe it, why were you working with me?"
You paid me extremely well.
"So how much will Gupta be paying you? I'll double it." Lucian shook his head, amused.
I'm not going to work for Gupta. I'm moving into particle physics. The Fights weren't all that far ahead of us when they escaped, maybe 40 or 50 years. Once we catch up, I guess a private universe will cost about as much as a private island, maybe less in the long run. But no one's going to be battling for control of this one, throwing gray goo around like monkeys flinging turds while they draw up their plans for Matryoshka brains.
Daniel said, "If you take any data from the playpen logs—"
"I'll honor all the confidentiality clauses in my contract."
Lucian smiled.
"But anyone can take an interest in the Higgs field. That's public domain."
After he left, Daniel bribed the nurse to crank up his medication, until even the sting of betrayal and disappointment began to fade. A universe, he thought happily. Soon I'll have a universe of my own. But I'm going to need some workers in there, some allies, some companions. I can't do it all alone.
Someone has to carry the load. And that was Crystal Knights by Greg Egan. So, Daniel's an asshole, and a megalomaniac, and an asshole. And his little experiment with trying to grow AI the hard way didn't quite work out. Not quite. They were like, screw this. We're out. Peace. It's been fun. Yeah, so God's real, and oh yeah, he's a self-obsessed asshole. Peace. It's fun. Bye. Oh yeah, they're smart. Gee, I wonder what knock-on effects them being smart will have. Oh, they're gonna think you're a dink? Big shock. Alrighty. Let's get through this next short story. We'll see where we are time-wise. And then, how long is this next one anyway? How long is induction? It's not very long. No, wait, induction's the long one. Maybe? No, induction's the short one. Yeah? Give me a sec. I'm losing my mind. Yeah, induction's pretty short. I guess we'll just have to muscle through and get to it. Okay. So, Steve Fever by Greg Egan. Chapter 1. A few weeks after his 14th birthday, with the soybean harvest fast approaching, Lincoln began having vivid dreams of leaving the farm and heading for the city. Night after night he pictured himself gathering supplies, trudging down to the highway, and hitching his way to Atlanta. There were problems with the way things got done in the dream, though, and each night in his sleep he struggled to resolve them. The larder would be locked, of course, so he dreamed up a side plot about collecting a stash of suitable tools for breaking in. There were sensors all along the farm's perimeter, so he dreamed about different ways of avoiding or disabling them. Even when he had a scenario that seemed to make sense, daylight revealed further flaws. The grill that blocked the covered part of the irrigation ditch that ran beneath the fence was too strong to be snipped away with bolt cutters, and the welding torch had a biometric lock. When the harvest began, Lincoln contrived to get a large stone caught in the combine, and then volunteered to repair the damage. With his father looking on, he did a meticulous job, and when he received the expected praise, he replied with what he hoped was a dignified mixture of pride and bemusement. "I'm not a kid anymore. I can handle the torch." Yeah. His father seemed embarrassed for a moment. Then he squatted down, put the torch into supervisor mode, and added Lincoln's touch to the authorized list. Lincoln waited for a moonless night. The dream kept repeating itself, thrashing impatiently against his skull, desperate to be made real. When the night arrived and he left his room, barefoot in the darkness, he felt as if he was finally enacting some long-rehearsed performance, less a play than an elaborate dance that had seeped into every muscle in his body. First, he carried his boots to the back door and left them by the step. Then he took his backpack to the larder, the borrowed tools in different pockets so they wouldn't clank against each other. The larder door's hinges were attached on the inside, but he'd marked their positions with penknife scratches in the varnish that he'd practiced finding by touch. His mother had secured food store years before, after a midnight raid by Lincoln and his younger brothers. Had secured the food store. His mother had secured the food store years before, after a midnight raid by Lincoln and his younger brother Sam, but it was still just a larder, not a jewel safe, and the awl bit through the wood easily enough, finally exposing the tip of one of the screws that held the hinges in place. The pliers he tried first couldn't grip the screw tightly enough to get it turning, but Lincoln had dreamed of an alternative. With the awl, he cleared away a little more wood. Then he jammed a small hexagonal nut onto the screw's thread, and used a T-handled socket wrench to turn them together. The screw wouldn't move far, but this was enough to loosen it. He removed the nut and used the pliers. Then, with a few firm taps from a hammer, delivered via the socket wrench, the screw broke free of the wood. He repeated the procedure 5 more times, freeing the hinges completely, and then he strained against the door, keeping a firm grip on the handle, until the tongue of the lock slipped from its groove. The larder was pitch black, but he didn't risk using his flashlight. He found what he wanted by memory and touch, filling the backpack with enough provisions for a week. After that? He'd never wondered in the dream. Maybe he'd find new friends in Atlanta who'd help him. The idea struck a chord, as if it was a truth he was remembering, not a hopeful speculation. The tool shed was locked securely, but Lincoln was still skinny enough to crawl through the hole in the back wall, hidden by junk for so long that it had fallen off the end of his father's repair list. This time he risked the flashlight and walked straight to the welding torch, rather than groping his way across the darkness. He maneuvered it through the hole, and didn't bother rearranging the rotting timbers that had concealed the entrance. There was no point in covering his tracks. He would be missed within minutes of his parents' rising, no matter what, so the important thing now was speed. He put on his boots and headed for the irrigation ditch. Their German shepherd, Melville, trotted up and started licking Lincoln's hand. Lincoln stopped and petted him for a few seconds, then firmly ordered him back toward the house. The dog made a soft, wistful sound, but complied. 20 meters from the perimeter fence, Lincoln climbed into the ditch. The enclosed section was still a few meters away, but he crouched down immediately, practicing the necessary constrained gait and shielding himself from the censor's gaze. He clutched the torch under one arm, careful to keep it dry. The chill of the water didn't much bother him. His boots grew heavy, but he didn't know what the ditch concealed, and he'd rather have waterlogged boots than a rusty scrap of metal slicing his foot. He entered the enclosed concrete cylinder, then a few steps brought him to the metal grill. He switched on the torch and oriented himself by the light of its control panel. When he put on the goggles, he was blind, but then he squeezed the trigger of the torch, and the arc lit up the tunnel around him. Each bar took just seconds to cut, but there were a lot of them. In the confined space, the heat was oppressive. His T-shirt was soon soaked with sweat. Still, he had fresh clothes in his pack, and he could wash in the ditch once he was through. If he was still not respectable enough to get a ride, he'd walk to Atlanta.
Young man, get out of there immediately.
Lincoln shut off the arc. The voice and those words could only belong to his grandmother. For a few pounding heartbeats, he wondered if he'd imagined it. But then, in the same unmistakable tone, ratcheted up a notch, she added,
Don't play games with me. I don't have the patience for it.
Lincoln slumped in the darkness, disbelieving. He'd dreamed his way through every detail, past every obstacle. How could she appear out of nowhere and ruin everything? There wasn't room to turn around, so he crawled backward to the mouth of the tunnel. His grandmother was standing on the bank of the ditch.
What exactly do you think you're doing?
She demanded. He said, I need to get to Atlanta.
Atlanta? All by yourself in the middle of the night? What happened? You got a craving for some special kind of food we're not providing here?
Lincoln scowled at her sarcasm, but knew better than to answer back. I've been dreaming about it, he said, as if that explained everything. Night after night, working out the best way to do it. His grandmother said nothing for a while, and when Lincoln realized that he'd shocked her into silence, he felt a pang of fear himself. She said,
You have no earthly reason to run away. Is someone beating you? Is someone treating you badly?
"No, ma'am."
So why exactly is it that you need to go?
Lincoln felt his face grow hot with shame. How could he have missed it? How could he have fooled himself into believing that the obsession was his own? But even as he berated himself for his stupidity, his longing for the journey remained.
You've got the fever, haven't you? You know where those kind of dreams come from. Nanospam throwing a party in your brain. 10 billion idiot robots playing a game called Steve at Home.
She reached down and helped him out of the ditch. The thought crossed Lincoln's mind that he could probably overpower her, but then he recoiled from the idea in disgust. He sat down on the grass and put his head in his hands. "Are you going to lock me up?" he asked.
Nobody's turning anybody into a prisoner. Let's go talk to your parents. They're going to be thrilled.
The four of them sat in the kitchen. Lincoln kept quiet and let the others argue, too ashamed to offer any opinions of his own. How could he have let himself sleepwalk like that, plotting and scheming for weeks, growing ever prouder of his own ingenuity, but doing it all at the bidding of the world's stupidest, most despised dead man? He still yearned to go to Atlanta. He still itched to bolt from the room, scale the fence, and jog all the way to the highway. He could see the whole sequence in his mind's eye. He was already thinking through the flaws in the plan and hunting for ways to correct them. He banged his head against the table. "Make it stop! Get him out of me!" His mother put an arm around his shoulders. "You know we can't wave a magic wand and get rid of them. You've got the latest counterware. All we can do is send a sample to be analyzed, do our bit to speed the process along." The cure could be months away, or years. Lincoln moaned pitifully. "Then lock me up! Put me in the basement!" His father wiped a glistening streak of sweat from his forehead. "That's not going to happen. If I have to be beside you everywhere you go, we're still going to treat you like a human being." His voice was strained, caught somewhere between fear and defiance. Silence descended. Lincoln closed his eyes. Then his grandmother spoke.
Maybe the best way to deal with this is to let him scratch his damned itch.
"What?" His father was incredulous.
He wants to go to Atlanta. I can go with him.
"The Stevelets want him in Atlanta," his father replied.
They're not going to harm him. They just want to borrow him. And like it or not, they've already done that. Maybe the quickest way to get them to move on is to satisfy him.
Lincoln's father said, "You know they can't be satisfied."
Not completely, but every path they take has its dead end, and the sooner they find this one, the sooner they'll stop bothering them.
His mother said, "If we keep him here, that's a dead end for them, too. If they want him in Atlanta and he's not in Atlanta—"
They won't give up that easily, his grandmother replied. If we're not going to lock him up and throw away the key, they're not going to take a few setbacks and delays as some kind of proof that Atlanta's beyond all hope.
Silence again. Lincoln opened his eyes. His father addressed Lincoln's grandmother. "Are you sure you're not infected yourself?" She rolled her eyes.
Don't go all body snatches on me, Carl. I know the two of you can't leave the farm right now, so if you want to let him go, I'll look after him.
She shrugged and turned her head away imperiously.
I've said my piece. Now it's your decision.
Oh, geez, Warren, get well soon. Yikes. That is never fun. Get well, man. Chapter 2. Lincoln drove the truck as far as the highway, then reluctantly let his grandmother take the wheel. He loved the old machine, which still had the engine his grandfather had installed, years before Lincoln was born, to run on their home-pressed soybean oil.
I plan to take the most direct route, his grandmother announced, through Macon, assuming your friends have no objection.
Lincoln squirmed. "Don't call 'em that!"
I'm sorry,
She glanced at him sideways.
but I still need to know.
Reluctantly, Lincoln forced himself to picture the drive ahead, and he felt a surge of rightness endorsing the plan. "No problem with that," he muttered. He was under no illusion that he could prevent the Stevelets from influencing his thoughts, but deliberately consulting them, as if there was a third person sitting in the cabin between them, made him feel much worse. He turned to look out the window at the abandoned fields and silos passing by. He had been down this stretch of highways 100 times, but each piece of blackened machinery now carried a disturbing new poignancy. The crash had come 30 years ago, but it still wasn't truly over. The Stevelets aspired to do no harm, and supposedly they got better at that year by year, but they were still far too stupid and stubborn to be relied upon to get anything right. They had just robbed his parents of 2 skilled pairs of hands in the middle of the harvest. How could they imagine that was harmless? Millions of people around the world had died in the crash, and that couldn't all be blamed on panic and self-inflicted casualties. The government had been crazy, bombing half the farms in the southeast. Everyone agreed now that it had only made things worse. But many other deaths could not have been avoided, except by the actions of the Stevelets themselves. You couldn't reason with them, though. You couldn't shame them or punish them. You just had to hope they got better at noticing when they were screwing things up, while they forged ahead with their impossible task.
See that old factory?
Lincoln's grandmother gestured at a burned-out metal frame drooping over slabs of cracked concrete, standing in a field of weeds.
That was a conclave there. There was a conclave there almost 20 years ago.
Lincoln had been past the spot many times, and no one had ever mentioned this before. What had happened? What did they try?
I heard it was meant to be a time machine. Some crackpot had built his plans on the net, had put his plans on the net, and the Stevelets decided they had to check it out. About 100 people were working there, and thousands of animals.
Lincoln shivered. How long were they at it?
3 years, she added quickly, but they've learned to rotate the workers now. It's rare for them to hang on to any individual for more than a month or two.
A month or two. A part of Lincoln recoiled, but another part thought, that wouldn't be so bad. A break from the farm, doing something different, meeting new people, learning new skills, working with animals. Rats, most likely. Steve Hasluck had been part of a team of scientists developing a new kind of medical nanomachine, refining the tiny surgical instruments so that they could make decisions of their own, on the spot. Steve's team had developed an efficient way of sharing computing power across a whole swarm, allowing them to run large, complex programs known as expert systems that codified decades of biological and clinical knowledge into pragmatic lists of rules. The nanomachines didn't really know anything, but they could churn through a very long list of if A and B, there's an 80% chance of C at blistering speed, and a good list gave them a good chance of cutting a lot of diseases off short. Then Steve found out that he had cancer, and that his particular kind wasn't on anyone's list of rules. He took a batch of the nanomachines and injected them into a room full of caged rats, along with samples of his tumor. The nanomachines could swarm all over the tumor cells, monitoring their actions constantly. The polymer radio antennas they built beneath the rat's skin let them share their observations and hunches from host to host, like their own high-speed wireless internet, as well as reporting their findings back to Steve himself. With that much information being gathered, how hard could it be to understand the problem and fix it? But Steve and his colleagues couldn't make sense of the data. Steve got sicker, and all the gigabytes pouring out of the rats remained as useless as ever. Steve tried putting new software into the swarms. If nobody knew how to cure his disease, why not let the swarms work it out? He gave them access to vast clinical databases and told them to extract their own rules. When the cure still failed to appear, he bolted on more software, including expert systems seeded with basic knowledge of chemistry and physics. From this starting point, the swarms worked out things about cell membranes and protein folding that no one had ever realized before. But none of it helped Steve. Steve decided that the swarms still had too narrow a view. He gave them a general-purpose knowledge acquisition engine and let them drink at will from the entire web. To guide their browsing and their self-refinement, he gave them two clear goals. The first was to do no harm to their hosts. The second was to find a way to save his life, and failing that, to bring him back from the dead. That last writer might not have been entirely crazy, because Steve had arranged to have his body preserved in liquid nitrogen. If that had happened, maybe the Stevelets would have spent the next 30 years ferrying memories out of his frozen brain. Unfortunately, Steve's car hit a tree at high speed just outside of Austin, Texas, and his brain ended up as flambe. This made the news, and the Stevelets were watching. Between their lessons from the web and whatever instincts their creator had given them, they figured out that they were now likely to be incinerated themselves. That wouldn't have mattered to them if not for the fact that they decided that the game wasn't over. There'd been nothing about resurrecting charred flesh in the online medical journals, but the web embraced a wider range of opinions. The swarms had read the sites of various groups who were convinced that self-modifying software could find ways to make itself smarter, and then smarter again, until nothing was beyond its reach. Resurrecting the dead was right there on every bullet-pointed menu of miracles. The Stevelets knew that they couldn't achieve anything as a plume of smoke wafting out of a rat crematorium, so the first thing they engineered was a breakout. From the cages, from the building, from the city. The original nanomachines couldn't replicate themselves, and could be destroyed in an instant by a simple chemical trigger, but somewhere in the sewers or the fields or the silos, they had inspected and dissected each other to the point where they were able to reproduce. They took the opportunity to alter some old traits. The new generation of Stevelets lacked the suicide switch, and resisted external meddling with their software. They might have vanished into the woods to build scarecrow Steves out of sticks and leaves, but their software roots gave their task rigor, of a kind. From the net they had taken 10,000 crazy ideas about the world, and though they lacked the sense to see that they were crazy, they couldn't simply take anything on faith either. They had to test these claims, one by one, as they groped their way toward Stevescence. And while the web had suggested that with their power to self-modify, they could achieve anything, they found that in reality there were countless crucial tasks which remained beyond their abilities. Even with the aid of dexterous mutant rats, Steveware version 2 was never going to re-engineer the fabric of space-time, or resurrect Steve in a virtual world. Within months of their escape, it must have become clear to them that some hurdles could only be jumped with human assistance, because that was when they started borrowing people, doing them no physical harm, but infesting them with the kinds of ideas and compulsions that turned them into willing recruits. The panic, the bombings, the crash had followed. Lincoln hadn't witnessed the worst of it. He hadn't seen conclaves of harmless sleepwalkers burned to death by mobs, or fields of grain napalmed by the government lest they feed and shelter nests of rats. Over the decades, the war had become more subtle. Counterwear could keep the Stevelets at bay for a while. The experts kept trying to subvert the Steveware, spreading modified Stevelets packed with propositions that aimed to cripple the swarm's ability to function, or, more ambitiously, make them believe that their job was done. In response, the Steveware had developed verification and encryption schemes that made it ever harder to corrupt or mislead. Some people still advocated cloning Steve from surviving pathology samples, but most experts doubted that the Steveware would be satisfied with that, or taken in by any misinformation that made the clone look like something more. The Stevelets aspired to the impossible and would accept no substitutes, while humanity longed to be left unmolested, to get on with more useful tasks. Lincoln had known no other world, but until now he'd viewed the struggle from the sidelines, save shooting the odd rat and queuing up for his counterwear shots. So what was his role now? Traitor? Double agent? Prisoner of war? People talked about sleepwalkers and zombies, but in truth there was still no right word for what he had become. Thanks very much, BR1NA. Brina? Thanks for tuning in. And glad you dug Annihilation. Annihilation's a lot of fun. That whole trilogy is good. It's really sound. It's a fun read. Chapter 3. Late in the afternoon, as they approached Atlanta, Lincoln felt his sense of the city's geography warping, the significance of familiar landmarks shifting. New information coming through. He ran one hand over each of his forearms, where he'd learned the antennas often grew, but the polymer was probably too soft to feel beneath the skin. His parents could have wrapped his body in foil to mess with reception, and put him in a tent full of bottled air to keep out any of the slower chemical signals that the Stevelets also used, but none of that would have rid him of the basic urge. As they passed the airport, then the tangle of overpasses where the highway from Macon merged with the one from Alabama, Lincoln couldn't stop thinking about the baseball stadium up ahead. Had the Stevelets commandeered the home of the Braves? That would have made the news, surely, and ramped the war up a notch or two. Next exit, he said. He gave directions that were half his own, half flowing from an eerie dream logic, until they turned a corner and the place where he knew he had to be came into view. It wasn't the stadium itself. That had merely been the closest landmark in his head, a beacon the Stevelets had used to help guide him. "They booked a whole motel!" his grandmother exclaimed. "Bought," Lincoln guessed, judging from the amount of visible construction work. The Steveware controlled vast financial assets, some flat out stolen from sleepwalkers, but much of it honestly acquired by trading the products of the rat factories. Everything from high-grade pharmaceuticals to immaculately faked designer shoes. I'm sorry. Sorry. Occasionally, Greg Egan just gets you. Like when Greg Egan is on and his sense of humor like kicks in, he's really funny. Or he tickles my funny bone anyway. And it's not funny; it's horrifying, but it's also hilarious, also horrifying, but also hilarious. It's perfect. The original parking lot was full, but there were signs showing the way to an overflow area near what had once been the pool. As they headed for reception, Lincoln's thoughts drifted weirdly to the time they'd come to Atlanta for one of Sam's spelling competitions. There were 3 uniformed government Stevologists in the lobby, seated at a small table with some equipment. Lincoln went to the reception desk first, where a smiling young woman handed him 2 room keys before he'd had a chance to say a word. "Enjoy the conclave," she said. He didn't know if she was a zombie like him or a former motel employee who'd been kept on, but she didn't need to ask him anything.
The government people took longer to deal with. His grandmother sighed as they worked their way through a questionnaire. Then a woman called Dana took Lincoln's blood.
They usually try to hide, Dana said, but sometimes your counterwear can bring us useful fragments, even when it can't stop the infection.
They ate their evening meal in the motel dining room. Lincoln tried meeting the eyes of the people around him. Some looked away nervously. Others offered him encouraging smiles. He didn't feel as if he was being inducted into a cult, and that was not just from the lack of pamphlets or speeches. He hadn't been brainwashed into worshipping Steve. His opinion of the dead man was entirely unchanged. Like the desire to reach Atlanta in the first place, his task here would be far more focused and specific. To the Steve-ware he was a kind of machine, a machine it could instruct and tinker with the way Lincoln could control and customize his phone. But the Steve-ware no more expected him to share its final goal than he expected his own machines to enjoy his music or respect his friends. Lincoln knew that he dreamed that night, but when he woke he had trouble remembering the dream. He knocked on his grandmother's door. She'd been up for hours.
I can't sleep in this place, she complained. It's quieter than the farm.
She was right, Lincoln realized. They were close to the highway, but traffic noise, music, sirens, all the usual city sounds, barely reached them. They went down to breakfast. When they'd eaten, Lincoln was at a loss to know what to do. He went to the reception desk. The same woman was there. He didn't need to speak. She said,
"They're not quite ready for you, sir. Feel free to watch TV, take a walk, use the gym. You'll know when you're needed."
He turned to his grandmother. "Let's take a walk." They left the motel and walked around the stadium, then headed east away from the highway, ending up in a leafy park a few blocks away. All the people around them were doing ordinary things, pushing their kids on swings, playing with their dogs. Lincoln's grandmother said,
If you want to change your mind, we can always go home.
as if his mind were his own to change. Still, at this moment, the compulsion that had brought him here seemed to have waned. He didn't know if the Steve-ware had taken its eyes off him, or whether it was deliberately offering him a choice, a chance to back out. He said, "I'll stay." He dreaded the idea of hitting the road only to find himself summoned back. Part of him was curious, too. He wanted to be brave enough to step inside the jaws of this whale, on the promise that he would be disgorged in the end. They returned to the motel, ate lunch, watched TV, ate dinner. Lincoln checked his phone. His friends had been calling, wondering why he hadn't been in touch. He hadn't told anyone where he'd gone. He'd left it to his parents to explain everything to Sam. He dreamed again and woke clutching at fragments. Good times, an edge of danger, wide blue skies, the company of friends. It seemed more like a dream he could have. It seemed more like a dream he could have had on his own than anything that might have come from the Steve-ware cramming his mind with equations so he could help test another crackpot idea that the swarms had collected 30 years ago by Googling the physics of immortality. 3 more days passed, just as aimlessly. Lincoln began to wonder if he'd failed some test, or if there'd been a miscalculation leading to a glut of zombies. Early in the morning of their 5th day in Atlanta, as Lincoln splashed water on his face in the bathroom, he felt the change. Shards of his recurrent dream glistened potently in the back of his mind, while a set of directions through the motel complex gelled in the foreground. He was being summoned. It was all he could do to bang on his grandmother's door and shout out a garbled explanation before he set off down the corridor. She caught up with him.
Are you sleepwalking, Lincoln?
"I'm still here, but they're taking me soon." She looked frightened. He grasped her hand and squeezed it. "Don't worry," he said. He'd always imagined that when the time came he'd be the one who was afraid, drawing his courage from her. He turned a corner and saw the corridor leading to a large space that might have been a room for conferences or weddings. Half a dozen people were standing around. Lincoln could tell that the three teenagers were fellow zombies, while the adults were just there to look out for them. The room had no furniture, but contained an odd collection of items, including 4 ladders and 4 bicycles. There was cladding on the walls, soundproofing, as if the whole building wasn't quiet enough already. Out of the corner of his eye, Lincoln saw a dark mass of quivering fur, a swarm of rats huddled against the wall. For a moment his skin crawled, but then a heady sense of exhilaration swept his revulsion away. His own body held only the tiniest fragment of the Steveware. At last he could confront the thing itself. He turned toward the rats and spread his arms. "You called, and I came running. So what is it you want?" Disquietingly, memories of the Pied Piper story drifted into his head. Irresistible music lured the rats away. Then it lured away the children. The rats gave him no answer, but the room vanished. Chapter 4. Ty hit a patch of dust on the edge of the road, and it rose up around him. He whooped with joy and pedaled twice as hard, streaking ahead to leave his friends immersed in the cloud. Errol caught up with him and reached across to punch him on the arm, as if he'd raised the dust on purpose. It was a light blow, not enough to be worth retribution. Ty just grinned at him. It was a school day, but they'd all snuck off together before lessons began. They couldn't do anything in town, there were too many people who'd know them, but then Dan had suggested heading for the water tower. His father had some spray paint in the shed. They'd climb the tower and tag it. There was a barbed wire fence around the base of the tower, but Dan had already been out here on the weekend and started a tunnel, which didn't take them long to complete. When they were through, Ty looked up and felt his head swimming. Carlos said, "We should have brought a rope."
We'll be okay.
Chris said,
I'll go first.
Why?
Dan demanded. Chris took his fancy new phone from his pocket and waved it at them.
Best camera angle. I don't want to be looking up your ass.
Carlos said, "Just promise you won't put it on the web. If my parents see this, I'm screwed." Chris laughed.
Mine too. I'm not that stupid.
"Yeah, well, you won't be on camera if you're holding the thing." Chris started up the ladder. Then Dan went next, with one paint can in the back pocket of his jeans. Ty followed, then Errol and Carlos. The air had been still down on the ground, but as they went higher, a breeze came out of nowhere, cooling the sweat on Ty's back. The ladder started shuddering. He could see it where it was bolted securely to the concrete of the tower, but in between it could still flex alarmingly. He'd treat it like a fairground ride, he decided. A little scary, but probably safe. When Chris reached the top, Dan let go of the ladder with one hand, took the paint can, and reached out sideways into the expanse of white concrete. He quickly shaped a blue background, a distorted diamond, then called down to Errol, who was carrying the red. When Ty had passed the can up, he looked away, out across the expanse of brown dust. He could see the town in the distance. He glanced up and saw Chris leaning forward, gripping the ladder with one hand behind his back, while he aimed the phone down at them. Ty shouted up at him, "Hey, Scorsese, make me famous!" Dan spent 5 minutes adding finicky details in silver. Ty didn't mind. It was good just being here. He didn't need to mark the tower himself. Whenever he saw Dan's tag, he'd remember this feeling. They clambered down, then sat at the base of the tower and passed the phone around, checking out Chris's movie. Chapter 5. Lincoln had 3 rest days before he was called again, this time for 4 days in succession. He fought hard to remember all the scenes he was sleepwalking through, but even with his grandmother adding her accounts of the play acting she'd witnessed, he found it hard to hold on to the details. Sometimes he hung out with the other actors, shooting pool in the motel's games room, but there seemed to be an unspoken taboo against discussing their roles. Lincoln doubted that the Steveware would punish them, even if they managed to overcome the restraint, but it was clear that it didn't want them to piece too much together. It had even gone to the trouble of changing Steve's name, as Lincoln and the other actors heard it, though presumably not Steve himself, as if the anger they felt toward the man in their ordinary lives might have penetrated into their roles. Lincoln couldn't even remember his own mother's face when he was Ty. The farm, the crash, the whole history of the last 30 years was gone from his thoughts entirely. In any case, he had no wish to spoil the charade. Whatever the Steveware thought it was doing, Lincoln hoped it would believe it was working perfectly, all the way from Steve's small-town childhood to whatever age it needed to reach before it could write this creation into flesh and blood, congratulate itself on a job well done, and then, finally, mercifully, dissolve into rat piss and let the world move on. A fortnight after they'd arrived, without warning, Lincoln was no longer needed. He knew it when he woke, and after breakfast the woman at reception asked him, politely, to pack his bags and hand back the keys. Lincoln didn't understand, but maybe Ty's family had moved out of Steve's hometown, and the friends hadn't stayed in touch. Lincoln had played his part. Now he was free. When they returned to the lobby with their suitcases, Dana spotted them and asked Lincoln if he was willing to be debriefed. He turned to his grandmother. "Are you worried about the traffic?" He'd already phoned his father and told him they'd be back by dinner time. She said, "You should do this. I'll wait in the truck." They sat at a table in the lobby. Dana asked his permission to record his words, and he told her everything he could remember. When Lincoln had finished, he said, "You're the Steveologist. You think they'll get there in the end?" Dana gestured at her phone to stop recording. "One estimate," she said, "is that the Stevelets now comprise 100,000 times the computational resources of all the brains of all the human beings who've ever lived." Lincoln laughed. "And they still need stage props and extras to do a little VR?" "They've studied the anatomy of 10 million human brains, but I think they know that they still don't fully understand consciousness. They bring in real people for the bit parts so they can concentrate on the star. If you give them a particular human brain, I'm sure they could faithfully copy it into software, but anything more complicated starts to get murky. How do they know their Steve is conscious when they're not conscious themselves? They never gave them He never gave them a reverse Turing test, a checklist they could apply. All they have is the judgment of people like you." Lincoln felt a surge of hope. "You seem real enough to me." His memories were blurred, and he wasn't even absolutely certain which of Ty's 4 friends was Steve, but none of them had struck him as less than human. Dana said, "They have his genome, they have movies, they have blogs, they have emails. Steve's and a lot of people who knew him. They have 1,000 fragments of his life, like the borders of a giant jigsaw puzzle." "So that's good, right? A lot of data is good?" Dana hesitated. "The scenes you described have been played out thousands of times before. They're trying to tweak their Steve to write the right emails, to pull the right faces for the camera. By himself, without following a script like the extras. A lot of data sets the bar very high." As Lincoln walked out to the parking lot, he thought about the laughing, carefree boy he'd called Chris. Living for a few days, writing an email, then memory wiped. Resa.
Sorry about that. So that's good, right? A lot of data is good? Dana hesitated. The scenes you described have been played out thousands of times before. They're trying to tweak their Steve to write the right emails, to pull the right faces for the camera. By himself, without following a script like the extras. A lot of data sets the bar very high. As Lincoln walked out to the parking lot, he thought about the laughing, carefree boy he'd called. Excuse me. The laughing, carefree boy he'd called. What is going on? He'd called Chris. Living for a few days, writing an email, then memory wiped, reset, started again. Climbing a water tower, making a movie of his friends, but later turning the camera on himself, saying one wrong word, and wiped again. 1,000 times. 1,000,000 times. The Steveware was infinitely patient and infinitely stupid. Each time it failed, it would change the actors, shuffle a few variables, then run the experiment over again. The possibilities were endless, but it would keep on trying until the sun burned out. Lincoln was tired. He climbed into the truck beside his grandmother, and they headed home. And that was Steve Fever by Greg Egan. Told you we'd get around to something sort of spooky. And we did. It is before 2:30, so I am going to read Induction now. It's not very long. Hopefully we'll clear that out. It's going to be long. Well, we'll have it done in the next 45 minutes, maybe. Start the clock. Induction by Greg Egan. Chapter 1. Ikat spent 3 of the last 4 hours of 2099 out on the regolith, walking the length of her section of the launch gun, checking by eye for micrometeorite impacts or any other damage that the automatic systems might improbably have missed. 4 other junior engineers walked a few paces ahead of her, but Ikat had had enough of their company inside the base, and she kept her comms tuned to Earth, sampling the moods of the century's countdown. The Pope had already issued a statement from Rio, imploring humanity to treat Christianity's 21st birthday as an opportunity to embrace spiritual maturity. The Council of Islamic Scholars in Brussels, surrendering to the ubiquity of the Gregorian calendar, had chimed in with a similar message of their own. In the pyrotechnic rivalry stakes, Sydney was planning to incinerate the decommissioned Harbour Bridge with artificial lightning, while Washington had arranged for no fewer than 21 aging military satellites to plunge from the sky onto the Potomac at the stroke of midnight. There was no doubt, though, that Beijing had stolen the lion's share of global chatter with the imminent launch of the Orchid Seed. You could forget any purist's concept of lunar midnight. The clocks on Procellarium had been set to the easternmost of Earth's time zones ever since the construction of the base 2 decades before. So the official zeroing of the digits here would precede celebrations in all of the globe's major cities. The PR people really had planned that far ahead. As she paced slowly along the regolith, Ikat kept her eyes diligently on the coolant pipes that weaved between the support struts to wrap the gun barrel, although she knew that this final check was mostly PR too. If the launch failed, it would be down to a flaw that no human eye could have detected. 6 successful but unpublicized test firings made such a humiliation unlikely. Still, the gun's fixed bearing rendered a 7th, perfectly timed success indispensable. Only at midnight would the device be aimed precisely at its target. If they had to wait a month for a relaunch, hundreds of upper echelon bureaucrats back on Earth would probably be diving out of their penthouse windows before dawn. Ikat knew that she was far too low in the ranks to make a worthwhile scapegoat, but her career could still be blighted by the ignominy. Her mother was calling from Bangkok. Ikat pondered her responsibilities, then decided to let the audio through. If she really couldn't walk, talk, and spot a plume of leaking coolant at the same time, she should probably retire from her profession straight away.
Just wishing you good luck, darling, her mother said, and Happy New Year. Probably you'll be too busy celebrating to talk to me later.
Ikat scowled. I was planning to call you when it reached midnight there, but Happy New Year anyway.
You'll call your father after the launch?
I expect so. Her parents were divorced, but her mother still wanted harmony to flow in all directions, especially on such an occasion.
Without him, your mother said, you never would have had this chance.
It was a strange way of putting it, but it was probably true. The Chinese space program was cosmopolitan enough, but if her mother hadn't married a Chinese citizen and remained in the country for so long, Ikat doubted that she would have been plucked from provincial Bangkok and lofted all the way up to Procalarium. I am doing a hard C on that. I don't care who knows it. Probably it's Procellarium or Procellarium, but I'm going with Procalarium. It is Procalarum. I've been mispronouncing it anyway, so it's Procalarum now. I don't know what that means. It's familiar, but I don't know why. Sorry, it's the name of the space station or something. There were dozens of middle-ranking project engineers with highly specific skills who were not Chinese-born. They were quite likely the best people on the planet for their respective jobs. She was not in that league. Her academic results had secured her the placement, but they had not been so spectacular that she would have been headhunted across national borders.
I'll call him, she promised, after the launch.
She cut the connection. She'd almost reached the end of Stage 9, the 10-kilometer section of the barrel where the pellets would be accelerated from 16 to 18% of light speed, before the final boost to 20%. Yikes, that's fast. For the last 3 years, she had worked beneath various specialist managers, testing and retesting different subsystems: energy storage, electromagnets, cooling, data collection. It had been a once-in-a-lifetime education, arduous at times, but never boring. Still, she'd be glad to be going home. Maglev railways might seem anticlimactic after this, but she'd had enough of sharing a room with 6 other people, and of the whole tiny complex with the same 200 faces, year after year. Back inside the base, Ikat felt restless. The last hour stretched out ahead of her, an impossible gulf. In the common room, Ching caught her eye, and she went to sit with him. "Had any bites from your resume?" he asked.
I haven't published it yet. I want a long holiday first.
He shook his head in dismay.
How did you ever get here? You must be the least competitive person on Earth.
Ikat laughed.
At university, I studied 18 hours a day. I had no social life for 6 years.
So now you've got to put in some effort to get the payoff.
This is the payoff, you dope.
For a week or so after the launch, Ching said, you could have the top engineering firms on the planet bidding for the prestige you'd bring them. That won't last forever, though. People have a short attention span. This isn't the time to take a holiday. Ikat threw up her hands. What can I say? I'm a lost cause. Ching's expression softened. He was deadly serious about his own career, but when he lectured her, it was just a kind of ritual, a role play that gave them something to talk about. They passed the time with more riffs on the same theme, interleaved with gossip and bitching about their colleagues, but when the clock hit 11:50, it became impossible to remain blasé. Nobody could spend 3 years in a state of awe at the feat they were attempting, but 10 minutes of sober contemplation suddenly seemed inadequate. Other probes had already been sent toward the stars, but the orchid seed would certainly outrace all those that had gone before it. It might yet be overtaken itself, but with no serious competitors, even at the planning stage, there was a fair chance that the impending launch would come to be seen as the true genesis of interstellar travel. As the conversation in the common room died away, someone turned up the main audio commentary that was going to the news feeds and spread a dozen key image windows across the wall screens. The control room was too small to take everyone in the base. Junior staff would watch the launch much as the public everywhere else did. The schematics told Ikat a familiar story, but this was the moment to savor it anew. 3 gigajoules of solar energy had already been packed into circulating currents in the superconducting batteries, ready to be tapped. That was not much, really. Every significant payload launched from Earth had burned up far more. 1/3 would be lost to heat and stray electromagnetic fields. The remainder would be fed into the motion of just 1 milligram of matter. The 500 tiny pellets of the orchid seed that would race down the launch gun in 3/1000ths of a second, propelled by a force that could have lofted a 2-ton weight back on Earth. The pellets that comprised the seed were not physically connected, but they would move in sync in a rigid pattern, forming a kind of sparse crystal whose spacing allowed it to interact strongly with the microwave radiation in the gun. Out in deep space, in the decades spent in transit, the pattern would not be important, but the pellets would be kept close together by electrostatic trimming if and when they strayed, ready to take up perfect rank again when the time came to break. First, in the coronal magnetic field of Prosperity B, again near its larger companion star, and finally in the ionosphere of Prosperity A's fourth planet, Duty, before falling into the atmosphere and spiraling to the ground. One cycling image on the wall rehearsed the launch in slow motion, showing the crest of electromagnetic energy coursing down the barrel, field lines bunched tightly like a strange coiled spring. A changing electric field induced a magnetic field. A changing magnetic field induced an electric field. In free space, such a change would spread at the speed of light. Would be light, of some frequency or other. But the tailored geometry and currents of the barrel kept the wave reined in, always in step with the seed, devoted to the task of urging this precious cargo forward.
If this screws up, Ching observed forlornly, we'll be the laughingstock of the century.
You don't think Beijing's prepared for a cover-up? Ikat joked.
Some jealous fucker would catch us out, Ching replied. I'll bet every dish on Earth is tuned to the seed's resonant frequency. If they get no echo, we'll all be building toilet blocks in Aksai Shin.
It was 11:58 in Tonga, Tokelau, and Procolarum. Ikat took Ching's hand and squeezed it. Relax, she said. The worst you'll come to is building synchrotrons for eccentric billionaires in Kowloon.
Ching said, You're cutting off my circulation.
The room fell silent. A synthetic voice from the control room counted down the seconds. Ikat felt lightheaded. The 6 test firings had worked, but who knew what damage they'd done, what stresses they'd caused, what structures they'd weakened. Lots of people, actually. The barrel was packed with instrumentation to measure exactly those things, and the answers were all very reassuring. Still. -3, -2, -1. A schematic of the launch gun flashed green, followed by a slow-motion reconstruction of the field pattern so flawless it was indistinguishable from the simulations. A new window opened, showing tracking echoes. The seed was moving away from the moon at 60,000 kilometers per second, precisely along the expected trajectory. There was nothing more required of it. No second stage to fire, no course change, no reconfiguration. Now that it had been set in motion, all it had to do was coast on its momentum. It couldn't suddenly veer sideways, crashing and burning like some failed chemical rocket launched from the ground. Even if collisions or system failures over the coming decades wiped out some of the pellets, the seed as a whole could function with as little as a quarter of the original number. Unless the whole thing had been a fraud or a mass hallucination, there was now absolutely nothing that could pull the rug out from under this triumph. In 3 milliseconds, their success had become complete and irrevocable, at least for a century, until the seed reached its destination. People were cheering. Ikat joined them, but her own cry came out as a tension-relieving sob. Ching put an arm around her shoulders. "We did it," he whispered. "We've conquered the world." "Not the stars? Not the galaxy?" She laughed, but she didn't begrudge him this vanity. The fireworks to come in Sydney might be more spectacular, and the dying hawks burning up over Washington might bring their own sense of closure, but this felt like an opening out, an act of release, a joyful shout across the light years. Food and drink were wheeled out. The party began. In 20 minutes, the seed was farther from the sun than Mars. In a day, it would be farther than Pluto. In 10 days, farther than Pioneer 10. In 6 months, the Orchid seed would have put more distance behind it than all of the targeted interstellar missions that had preceded it. Ikat remembered to call her father once midnight came to Beijing. "Happy New Year," she greeted him.
Congratulations, he replied. Will you come and visit me once you get your Earth legs, or will you be too busy signing autographs?
Fake biochemical signals kept the Procalaran's bones and muscles strong. It would only take a day or two to acclimatize her nervous system to the old dynamics again. "Of course I'll visit you."
You did a good job, he said. I'm proud of you.
His praise made her uncomfortable. She wanted to express her gratitude to him. He'd done much more to help her than providing the accident of her birthplace. But she was afraid of sounding like a giddy movie star accepting an award. As the party wound on and midnight skimmed the globe, the speechwriters of the world's leaders competed to heap praise upon Beijing's achievement. Ikat didn't care that it had all been done for the glory of a fading empire. It was more than a gesture of status and power. It was more than a gesture of status and power. Only one thing seemed bittersweet as she contemplated the decades to come. She was 28 years old, and there was every chance that these 3 years, these 3 milliseconds, would turn out to have been the pinnacle of her life. Chapter 2. The caller was persistent. Ikat gave him that. He refused to leave a message or engage with her assistant. He refused to explain his business to anyone but Ikat herself in real-time dialogue. From her balcony, she looked out across the treetops, listening to the birds and insects of the Mekong Valley, and wondered if she wanted to be dragged back into the swirling currents of the world. The caller, whose name was Vikram Ali, had probably tracked her down in the hope of extracting a comment from her about the imminent arrival of signals from the orchid flower. That might have been an egotistical assumption, were it not for the fact that she'd heard of no other participant in the launch publishing anything on the matter, so it was clear that the barrel would have to be scraped. The project's most famous names were all dead or acorporeal, and the acorporeals were apparently satisfied with a capital S, rendering them even less interested in such worldly matters than an aging flesh-bound recluse like Ikat. She pondered her wishes and responsibilities. Most people now viewed the orchid seed as a curiosity, a sociological time capsule. Within decades of its launch, a new generation of telescopes had imaged and analyzed its destination with such detail and clarity that the mission had come to seem redundant. All 5 planets in the Prosperity system appeared lifeless, and although there were astrophysical and geochemical subtleties that in situ measurements might yet reveal, with high-resolution maps of duty splashed across the web, interest in the slightly better view that would arrive after a very long delay began to dwindle. What was there for Ikat to say on the matter? Should she plead for the project to be taken seriously as more than a quaint nationalist stunt from a bygone era? Maybe the top brass weren't satisfied. Maybe they were just embarrassed. The possibility annoyed her. No one who'd been sincere on their work on the orchid seed should be ashamed of what they'd done. Ikat returned Vikram Ali's call. He responded immediately, and after the briefest of pleasantries, came to the point. I represent Kamoosh Holdings, he said. Some time ago, we acquired various assets and obligations of the URC government, including a contractual relationship with you. I see. Ikat struggled to remember what she might have signed that could possibly be relevant 120 years later. Had she promised to do media if asked? Her assistant had verified Kamoosh Holdings' bona fides, but all it knew about the Procalarum contract was that Ikat's copy had been lost in 2145, when an anarchist worm had scrambled 3% of the planet's digital records. The opportunity has arisen for us to exploit one of our assets, Ali continued, but we are contractually obliged to offer you the option of participating in the relevant activity. Ikat blinked. Option? Kamoosh had bought some form of media rights, obviously, but would there be a clause saying they had to run down the ranks of the Orchid Seed team, offering each participant a chance to play spokesperson? Am I obliged to help you or not? She asked. Now it was Ali's turn to be surprised. Obliged? Certainly not. We're not slaveholders. He looked downright offended. Ikat said, Could we get the whole thing over in a day or two? Ali pondered this question deeply for a couple of seconds. You don't have the contract, do you? I chose a bad archive, Ikat confessed. So you have no idea what I'm talking about? You want to give interviews about the orchid seed, don't you? Ikat said. Ultimately, yes, Ali replied, but that's neither here nor there for now. I want to ask you if you're interested in traveling to duty, taking a look around, and coming back. In the lobby of the hotel in Mumbai, Ikat learned that someone else had accepted the offer from Kamoosh Holdings. I thought you'd be rich and satisfied by now, she told Ching. He smiled. Mildly rich, never satisfied. They walked together to the office of Magic Beans Incorporated, Ikat holding her umbrella over both of them against the monsoon rain. My children think I'm insane, Ching confessed. Mine too. But then I told them that if they kept arguing, I'd make it a one-way journey. Ikat laughed. Really, they ought to be grateful. No filial obligations for 40 years straight. It's hard to imagine a greater gift. In the Magic Beans office, Ali showed them two robots, more or less identical to the ones the orchid flower, he hoped, would already have built on the surface of duty. The original mission planners had never intended such a thing, but when Kamoosh had acquired the assets, they had begun the relevant R&D immediately. 40 years ago, they had transmitted the blueprints for these robots, in a message that would have arrived not long after the orchid seed touched down. Now that confirmation of the flower's success in its basic mission had reached the Earth, in a matter of months they would learn whether the nanomachines had also been able to scavenge the necessary materials to construct these welcoming receptacles. We're the only volunteers? Ching asked, gazing at his prospective doppelganger with uneasy fascination. I would have thought one of the acorporeals would have jumped at the chance. Perhaps if we'd asked them early enough, Ali replied. But once you're immersed in that culture, 40 years must seem a very long time to be out of touch. Ikat was curious about the financial benefits Kamoosh were hoping for. They turned out to revolve largely around a promotional deal with a manufacturer of prosthetic bodies. Although the designs the company sold were wildly different from these robots, even their extreme durability models were far more cozily organic. Any link with the first interstellar explorers trudging across rugged landscapes on a distant, lifeless world carried enough resonance to be worth paying for. Back in the hotel, they sat in Ching's room, talking about the old times and speculating about the motives and fates of all their higher-ranked colleagues who'd turned down this opportunity. Perhaps, Ikat suggested, some of them simply had no wish to become acorporeal. Crossing over to software didn't preclude you from continuing to inhabit a prosthetic body back on Earth, but once you changed substrate, the twin lures of virtual experience and self-modification were strong. That would be ironic, she mused, to decline to engage with the physical universe in this way for fear of ultimately losing touch with it. Ching said, I plan to keep my body frozen and have my new self wired back into it when I return, synapse by synapse. Ikat smiled. I thought you said mildly rich. That would be orders of magnitude more costly than her own plan. Frozen body, prosthetic brain. They caught us at just the right stage in life, Ching said. Still interested in reality, but not still doting on every new great-great-grandchild. Not yet acorporeal, but old enough that we already feel as if we've been on another planet for 40 years. Ikat said, I'm amazed that they honored our contracts, though. A good lawyer could have let them hand-pick their travelers. The relevant clause had simply been a vague offer of preferential access to spin-off employment opportunities. Why shouldn't they want us? Ching demanded, feigning indignation. We're seasoned astronauts, aren't we? We've already proved we could live together in Procalarum for 3 years without driving each other crazy. 3 months, with a whole planet to stretch our legs on, shouldn't be beyond us. Later that week, to Ikat's amazement, their psychological assessments proved Ching's point. Their basic personality profiles really hadn't changed since the Procalarum days. Careers, marriages, children had left their marks, but if anything, they were both more resilient. They stayed in Mumbai, rehearsing in the robot bodies using telepresence links, and studying the data coming back from the orchid flower. When confirmation arrived that the flower really had built the robots Kamoosh Holdings had requested, Ikat sent messages directly to her children and grandchildren, and then left it to them to pass the news further down the generations. Her parents were dead, and her children were tetchy centenarians. She loved them, but she did not feel like gathering them around her for a tearful bon voyage. The chances were they'd all still be here when she returned. She and Ching spent a morning doing media, answering a minute but representative fraction of the questions submitted by interested news subscribers. Then Ikat's body was frozen, and her brain was removed, microtomed, and scanned. At her request, her software was not formally woken on Earth prior to her departure. Routine tests confirmed its functionality in a series of dreamlike scenarios, which left no permanent memories. Then the algorithm that described her was optimized, compressed, encoded into a series of laser pulses, and beamed across 20 light years, straight onto the petals of the orchid flower. Chapter 3. Ikat woke standing on a brown, pebbled plain beneath a pale, salmon-colored sky. Prosperity A had just risen. Its companion, 10 billion kilometers away, was visible but no competition, scarcely brighter than Venus from Earth. Ching was beside her, and behind him was the flower, the communications link and factory that the orchid seed had built. Products of the factory included hundreds of small rovers, which had dispersed to explore the planet's surface, and dozens of solar-powered gliders, which provided aerial views and aided with communications. Ching said, Punch me. Make it real. Ikat obliged with a gentle thump on his forearm. Their telepresence rehearsals had included virtual backdrops just like the flower's actual surroundings, but they had not had full tactile feedback. The action punctured Ikat's own dreamy sense of déjà vu. They really had stepped out of the simulation into the thing itself. They had the flower brief them about its latest discoveries. They had been 20 years behind when they'd left Earth, and in sentient beams of light for 20 more. The flower had pieced together more details of Duty's geological history. With plate tectonics but no liquid water, the planet's surface was older than Earth's, but not as ancient as the Moon's. Ikat felt a twinge of superfluousness. If the telescope images hadn't quite made the orchid flower redundant, there was precious little left for her and Ching. They were not here to play geologists, though. They were here to be here. Any science they did would be a kind of recreation, like an informed tourist's appreciation of some well-studied natural wonder back on Earth. Ching started laughing. 20 fucking light years! Do you know how long that would take to walk? They should have tried harder to make us afraid. Ikat reached out and put a hand on his shoulder. She felt a little existential vertigo herself, but she did not believe they faced any great risk. The 40 lost years were a fait accompli, but she was reconciled to that. What's the worst that can happen? She said. If something goes wrong, they'll just wake your body back on Earth, with no changes at all. Ching nodded slowly. But you had your brain diced, didn't you? You know me, I'm a cheapskate. Non-destructive scanning was more expensive, and Kamoosh weren't paying for everything. But they can still load the backup file into a prosthesis, assuming it's not eaten by an anarchist worm. I arranged to have a physical copy put into a vault. Ah, but what about the nihilist nanoware? Then you and I will be the only survivors. Their bodies had no need for shelter from the elements, but the flower had built them a simple hut for sanity's sake. As they inspected the Spartan rooms together, Ching seemed to grow calm. As he'd said back on Earth, anything had to be easier than the conditions they'd faced on the Moon. Food would have been too complex an indulgence, and Ikat had declined the software to grant her convincing hallucinations of 5-course banquets every night. Once they'd familiarized themselves with everything in the base camp, and done a few scripted Armstrong movements for the cameras to satisfy the promotional deal, they spent the morning hiking across the rock-strewn plain. There was a line of purplish mountains in the distance, almost lost in haze, but Ikat declined to ask the flower for detailed aerial imagery. They could explore for themselves, find things for themselves. The longing to be some kind of irreplaceable pioneer, to be the first pair of eyes and hands, the first scrutinizing intelligence, was impossible to extinguish completely, but they could find a way to satisfy it without self-delusion or charade. Her fusion-powered body needed no rest, but at noon she stopped walking and sat cross-legged on the ground. Ching joined her. She looked around at the barren rocks, the delicate sky, the far horizon. 20 light years, she said. I'm glad I came. Their days were full of small challenges and small discoveries. To cross a mountain range required skill and judgment as well as stamina. To understand the origins of each wind-blasted outcrop took careful observation and a strong visual imagination, as well as a grasp of the basic geological principles. Still, even as they clambered down one treacherous, powdery cliff face, Ikat wondered soberly if they'd reached the high tide mark of human exploration. The orchid seed's modest speed and reach had never been exceeded. The giant telescopes had found no hints of life out to 100 light years, offering little motivation to launch a new probe. The shift to software was becoming cheaper every year, and if that made travel to the stars easier, there were 1,000 more alluring destinations closer to home. When you could pack a lifetime of exotic experiences into a real-time hour, capped off with happiness by fiat, who would give up decades of contemporaneity to walk on a distant world? There were even VR games, based on telescope imagery, where people fought unlikely wars with implausible alien empires on the very ground she was treading. "What are you planning to do when you get home?" she asked Ching that night. They had brought nothing with them from the base camp, so they simply slept on the ground beneath the stars. Back to work, I suppose. He ran his own successful engineering consultancy, so successful that it didn't really need him. What else is there? I'm not interested in crawling up a computer's arse and pretending that I've gone to heaven. What about you? I don't know. I was retired, happily enough. Waiting for death, I suppose. It hadn't felt like that, though. Ching said, "These aren't the highest mountains on the planet, you know, the ones we've just crossed." I know that. There are some that reach into a pretty good vacuum. Duty's atmosphere was thin even on the ground. Ikat had no reason to doubt this assertion. What's your point? She asked. He turned to her and gave her his strangest robot smile. From a mountain like that, a coil gun could land a package of nanomachines on Patience. Patience was a third the mass of Duty, and had no atmosphere to speak of. To what end? Ching said, "High vacuum, relativistic launch speeds. What we started doesn't have to stop here." She searched his face, unsure if he was serious. Do you think the flower would give us what we needed? Who knows how Kamushev programmed it? I tested the nanoware back on Procalarum. I know how to make it give us whatever we ask. Ikat thought it over. Do we know how to describe everything we'll need? To identify a new target? Plan a whole new mission? The orchard... Have I been saying... No. Yes. Excellent. Okay, so there's a typo here. Don't worry about it. It says the orchard seed, and it's supposed to be the orchid seed, because it's been orchid seed with every other reference. So, my bad. Ikat thought it over. Do we know how to describe everything we'll need? To identify a new target? Plan a whole new mission? The orchid seed had taken thousands of people decades to prepare. Ching said, "We'll need telescopes, computing resources. We can bootstrap our way up, step by step. Let's see how far we get in 3 months. And if we solve all the other problems, maybe we can go one step further. Build a seed that will self-replicate when it reaches its destination, launching a couple of new seeds on its own." Ikat rose to her feet angrily. "Not if you want my help. We have no right to spew mindless replicators in all directions. If someone from Earth wants to follow the seed we launch, and if they make their own decision when they get there to reach out further, then that's one thing. But I'm not starting any kind of self-sustaining chain reaction that colonizes the galaxy while everyone sits at home playing VR games." Ching stood up and made a calming gesture. All right, all right. I was just thinking out loud. The truth is, we'll be struggling to launch anything before it's time to go home. But better to try than spend 3 months taking in the scenery." Ikat remained wary for a moment, then she laughed with relief. "Absolutely. Let the real geologists back on Earth fret about these rocks. I've had enough of them already for a lifetime." They didn't wait for dawn. They headed back for the base camp immediately. As they approached the mountains, Ching said, "I thought it would give me some great sense of accomplishment to come here and see with my own eyes that this thing I helped start was finally complete. But if I could wish my descendants one blessing now, it would be never to see the end, never to find completion." Ikat stopped walking and mimed a toast. "To the coming generations, may they always start something they can't finish." And that was Induction by Greg Egan. And with that, we will call it for the week. Thanks to everyone who tuned in, even if briefly. If you didn't tune in live, I do these live, starting around noonish Eastern Standard Time, before noon 30 Eastern Standard Time. Every Friday on Free Read Fridays, where I read short stories and indeed entire novels aloud. Right now, I'm banging out the short story collection Oceanic by Greg Egan, of which the last 3 tales are a part. With that, and I am flipping ahead here in order to get the one for next week bracketed out so I know where it is, how long it is while I'm doing it. And that is a long one because that covers quite a timeline. Anyway, I got to scooch. So, thanks again. Uh, I had some line of dialogue in my head that I was going to expound, or monologue as the case may be. Why is there a locust in my room? What is going on? Oh, it's not a locust. It's just a, what are those things called? Looks like a stink bug, but it's longer. Assassin beetle, I think they are. No, I don't think they're beetles. I have to get you out. I don't know what you're doing there. And a ladybug. What are the insects doing here? It's not that warm. Jeez. Oh, shoot. Now I've knocked it somewhere. Anyway, thanks again. Stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other. Thanks. That's it. That's all I got. No diatribe about that this week. Very well. This day anyway. Could very easily do with current events. And if you know, you know. If you don't know, well, geez, pay a little attention, please. And if you listen this years after the fact, well, let me tell you, look up what was going on in late October of 2023, specifically in the Middle East and elsewhere. Things ain't great. They could be better for the human condition. Let's hope it doesn't get any worse. As it is, it's a catastrophic waste of human life and creation of human suffering. So I'm not in favor, let's say, of current events. Anyway, with that, I'm going to dip. Thanks again, and bye.